I was polishing the silver in the butler's pantry the night the Duke of Ashwick broke Miss Eleanor Fairweather's heart with 11 careless words, and I have never in 18 years of service forgotten the sound of her going still. That is the only way I can describe it. She did not gasp. She did not drop the tray of correspondence she carried, though her knuckles whitened around its edges. She simply stopped moving, there in the shadow of the library doorway, and became, for one terrible moment, exactly what he had just called her. Good God, is that woman still hovering about my house? I scarcely notice her more than I notice a chair. He said it to his steward, Mr. Prout, in a voice sharp with the particular fury of a man who has just lost an argument with his solicitors over the North Tenant leases, and wants somewhere to put his temper. He did not know Miss Fairweather stood not 4 feet distant in the doorway, waiting with the very letters he had asked for not 10 minutes before. Or perhaps, and this is the harder truth I have carried these many years, perhaps some small, ungenerous part of him did know, and did not trouble himself to care. My name is Thomas Harding, and at that time I was 2 years into my post as a footman at Ashwick Park, 20 years old and full of the particular invisibility that livery grants a man. Servants are furniture too, in the eyes of the great, though I have found over a long life that furniture sees a great deal that chairs and tables cannot report, and I intend to report all of it now, because I was there for the beginning of this story, and by God's good grace, I was there for its ending too. Miss Fairweather set the tray of letters upon the hall table with a care that told me everything. She did not fling them down. She did not weep, not then, not where anyone might see. She simply arranged them into a neat stack, squared their edges with 2 fingers as though the small ordering of paper might order something larger inside her, and walked away down the corridor with her spine so straight I thought of the ramrod my father had once shown me from his soldiering days. I was polishing silver, as I said, but I had a clear line of sight through the pantry door, and I did not look away. I do not know why I remember it so exactly, save that I was young, and it seemed to me a great injustice, and young men who witness injustice tend to keep the memory bright, the way a burn keeps its shape long after the fire is gone. Miss Eleanor Fairweather had come to Ashwick Park 4 years before that night, engaged as companion to the Duke's aunt, Lady Constance, a woman of 71 years, failing eyesight, and in temper that would have tried a saint. Miss Fairweather was, at that time, 26, the orphaned daughter of a country parson who had left her nothing but good sense, a fine hand for embroidery, and an education a good deal better than her circumstances warranted. She had answered an advertisement out of necessity rather than inclination, and she had made herself, within a fortnight of her arrival, so entirely indispensable to the smooth running of that difficult old lady's rooms that I believe half the house had forgotten Ashwick Park had ever functioned without her. She read to Lady Constance in the evenings. She managed her medicines, her correspondence, her small quarrels with the housekeeper over the placement of the fire screens. She soothed the old lady's rages, and more quietly, she saw to 100 small kindnesses below stairs that nobody above stairs ever noticed, a word of comfort to a weeping scullery maid, a fair hearing given to a footman wrongly accused of breaking a vase, myself among the beneficiaries of her quiet justice on more than one occasion. She was, in short, the sort of woman a great house runs on and never thanks, and the Duke of Ashwick in those years did not so much as know the color of her eyes. I should tell you something of him, though I confess it pains me even now, for I came in time to love that man as a kind of second father, and it grieves me to speak of what he was before he became what he is. Julian Ashworth, 7th Duke of Ashwick, had inherited his title at 24 upon his own father's sudden death, and had spent the 6 years since learning, in the hardest possible school, how to be a duke without ever quite learning how to be a man. He was proud in the old sense, the sense that curdles a fine character into something brittle, and he wore that pride the way another man might wear armor, because I believe, looking back on it with an old man's understanding, that he was frightened nearly out of his wits by the weight of everything his father had left him, and pride was the only shield he knew how to raise. He was not cruel by nature. I want that understood, because this is not a story about a monster reformed, but about a proud man who did not yet know how to see the people around him as anything but pieces of the machinery of his life. His tenants were rent rolls. His servants were hands and feet that kept the house running. And Miss Fairweather, who managed his aunt so ably that he never had to trouble himself with the old lady's moods, was to him not even a hand or a foot, but something more like a well-oiled hinge, necessary, unremarked, and entirely unregarded until the night it creaked, and even then he did not think to ask why. That night, in the aftermath of his outburst, he took himself off to his study, and I dare say never thought of the matter again before his head touched the pillow. But Miss Fairweather did not sleep. I know this because I passed her door near midnight, sent up with a message for the housekeeper, and saw the line of candlelight beneath it, and heard, very softly, the sound of drawers being opened and closed with the particular quiet of someone who does not wish to be discovered at a task. She was packing. I did not speak of it to a soul, not then. It was not my place, and besides, I did not yet understand what I was watching. It was only the next morning, when Miss Fairweather sought out Lady Constance directly after breakfast and gave her notice with a composure that left the old lady sputtering, that I understood the full shape of what had happened. "You cannot mean it," Lady Constance said, and I was arranging the breakfast things and could not help but hear, though I made myself very small and very slow about my work. 4 years, Eleanor, and you would leave me over what? What has happened? Has someone insulted you?" "No one has insulted me, my lady," Miss Fairweather said, and her voice was perfectly even. "I have simply come to understand that I have stayed in a house where I am not wanted, and I find I no longer wish to be a fixture in a room where I might as easily be a chair. I have an aunt in Bath who has long asked me to come to her, and I believe the time has come to go." It was not entirely true, that business about the aunt in Bath, or at least it was not the whole truth, but it was offered with such quiet dignity that Lady Constance, who I think in her heart understood a great deal more than she let on, did not press her further. The old lady wept, actually wept, when Miss Fairweather's trunk was carried down 3 days later, and pressed upon her a small sum of money for the road, that I happen to know was a good deal more generous than any severance the Duke himself would have thought to offer, had he thought of the matter at all, which he did not, because he was in London on business and did not return to Ashwick Park for a fortnight, by which time Miss Fairweather was gone entirely from his life, or so he believed. I carried her trunk to the carriage myself on the morning she left. It is a small thing, perhaps, in the accounting of a great house, one footman carrying one trunk, but I remember it because she thanked me by name. "Thomas," she said, "thank you, and you have always been kind, and no one at Ashwick Park in 4 years of my service had ever thanked me by name for anything, save Lady Constance, and on rare occasion, the old housekeeper." "Where will you go, miss, if I may ask it?" I said, for I was young and bold enough to ask what an older servant would have known to leave alone. She looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in her face that I did not understand then and understand very well now, the particular light of a person who has just realized, in the midst of grief, that she is also, for the first time in a long while, free. "I don't yet know, Thomas," she said, "but I find that not knowing frightens me a great deal less than staying would have." And then she was gone, the carriage wheels crunching down the long drive under the lime trees, and I stood there with my livery collar suddenly too tight around my throat, thinking that I had just watched something rare happen and not fully understanding what it was. I would not see Miss Eleanor Fairweather again for nearly 6 years, but I would spend a good part of those years watching, slowly and at close quarters, the education of a proud man who did not yet know what he had lost. The first sign of it came within that same fortnight, when the Duke returned from London, and found his aunt's rooms in a state of quiet disorder. Not untidiness precisely, for Lady Constance's own maid kept the physical rooms well enough, but a disorder of spirit. The old lady had grown fractious and weepy by turns, refused her medicines twice, and quarreled so bitterly with the new companion hastily engaged in Miss Fairweather's place that the poor woman gave notice within the month. "Where is Miss Fairweather?" the Duke asked me directly one morning, for I had the ill fortune to be the footman on duty in the breakfast room when Lady Constance, at the head of the table, burst into tears over nothing more than a cold cup of chocolate, and could not be consoled by anyone present. "Gone, your grace," I said. "These 3 weeks past. She gave her notice and went a family in Bath, I believe." He frowned at that, the first frown of true attention I had ever seen him direct toward the subject of Miss Fairweather. Gave her notice. Why should she do that? Was she not comfortable here? I confess I held my tongue about what I had overheard in the corridor that night, for it was not my place, and I was young enough still to fear for my position if I spoke too plainly to a duke. But something in my silence, or perhaps in the careful blankness I schooled my face into, must have told him there was more to the matter than he understood, for he looked at me a moment longer than was comfortable before turning back to his aunt's tears with the baffled helplessness of a man who has never in his life had to manage another person's feelings, and finds himself entirely unequipped for the task. That was the beginning, though he would not have called it so, and would not for years understand it as such. The house without Miss Fairweather in it began, slowly, to come apart at its quietest seams. Lady Constance grew more difficult, then genuinely unwell, for grief and loneliness are no kinder to the old than to the young, and within that year she had declined enough that a physician was engaged permanently, and the Duke, for the first time, was obliged to spend real hours of his own day sitting with his aunt, reading to her in a voice that I am told was stiff and unpracticed compared to the one she had lost. The house itself seemed to feel it. I do not mean this fancifully, only that a great house runs on 1,000 small kindnesses and courtesies that no one above stairs ever accounts for until they vanish. The younger maids, who Miss Fairweather had always had a gentle word for, grew skittish and unhappy under a housekeeper who had lost her gentling influence. Small disputes that Miss Fairweather would have smoothed over with a quiet aside now festered into real grievances. I do not say the Duke noticed all of this. He did not for a long while, but he noticed enough. He noticed that his aunt was unhappy. He noticed that his house, which he had always taken for a well-running machine requiring no attention from him, now required a great deal of attention and gave him no peace for it. It took him the better part of 2 years to ask, in so many words, what had actually happened the night Miss Fairweather gave her notice. He asked Lady Constance directly, on an evening when I was serving at a small family dinner and could not help but overhear, being obliged to stand at the sideboard the entire meal. "Aunt, I have wondered, did something occur before Miss Fairweather left us? You have never seemed yourself since." Lady Constance set down her spoon with the particular deliberate slowness of a woman deciding whether to spare a man's feelings or tell him a hard truth. She chose the hard truth, and I have always admired her for it. "She heard you, Julian," the old lady said. "The night before she left, she heard you tell Prout that you scarcely noticed her more than a chair. She never said as much to me outright. She is too proud and too kind for that, but I am not a fool, and I know precisely what sent her from this house within 24 hours of your saying it." I watched the Duke's face over the rim of the wine I was pouring, and I saw something happen there that I had not seen in the 2 years I had served him. A true and unguarded flinch, the look of a man struck somewhere he had not known he could be struck. "I never meant," he began, and stopped, because I think even he understood that what he had meant scarcely mattered beside what he had done. "You never meant her to hear it," Lady Constance said. "No, but you meant every word of it as you said it, Julian, and that is the trouble. You did not think her worth noticing enough to be careful of her feelings, because you did not think of her as having feelings to be careful of at all. That is what she heard, and that is why she left, and I have missed her sorely every day since, and so, I think, though you will not say it, have you?" He did not answer that. He set down his own glass, and I saw his jaw work once, and then he asked to be excused from the table before the sweet course was served, which I had never known him to do in 2 years of service, dinners at Ashwick Park being, in those days, occasions he guarded with the same jealous formality he guarded everything else. I do not say he became a different man overnight. Pride does not dissolve so easily, and the Duke of Ashwick's pride had been built up over 6 years of loneliness and duty, and the particular isolation of a young man thrust too early into a position that demanded he trust no one and lean on no one. But I began, from that dinner onward, to see small changes in him, the way one sees the first green nub of a bulb long before one sees the flower. He asked after the servants by name, for one thing which he had never troubled to do before. He noticed, and remedied, 3 separate small injustices below stairs that Miss Fairweather would once have quietly managed without his ever hearing of them. A lady's maid unjustly blamed for a torn gown, a groom denied a promised half-day, a scullery girl worked past all reason by an unkind cook. He began, in short, to see the machinery of his own house as made up of people rather than parts, and I believe, though I cannot prove it, that it was the ghost of Miss Fairweather's absence, and his aunt's grief, that taught him to look. He also, though he told no one this directly, began to make inquiries after her. I know this because it fell to me, in my 4th year of service and newly elevated to the position of under-butler, to carry correspondence to the receiving office in the village, and I saw, on more than one occasion, letters addressed in the Duke's own hand to a Mrs. A. Whitfield of Bath, making polite inquiry as to whether that lady knew the present direction of a Miss Eleanor Fairweather, formerly companion to Lady Constance Ashworth. The replies, when they came, were disappointing. The aunt in Bath, it transpired, had died some 18 months prior, a fact Miss Fairweather herself may not even have known when she gave her notice, or perhaps had known, and used regardless as a convenient shield for her pride. I never learned which, and Miss Fairweather had gone on from Bath to some situation unknown, leaving no forwarding direction that the correspondent could supply. The Duke did not speak of this to Lady Constance, not at first, I think from a certain shame at admitting how thoroughly he had lost track of a woman he had once considered no more remarkable than a chair. But he did not stop looking. Over the following years I carried, or knew of, at least 4 further attempts, a letter to an agency in London that had once supplied companions and governesses to good families, on the chance they might have placed her again. An inquiry made through his solicitor to a clergyman cousin of Miss Fairweather's late father, who proved to know nothing useful. Even on one occasion that struck me as almost comically thorough for a man of his pride, a discreet advertisement placed in a newspaper requesting information as to the whereabouts of a Miss E. F., formerly of Ashwick Park, offering a reward for reliable intelligence, which yielded nothing but 2 fraudulent claimants easily dismissed, and a great deal of embarrassment when Lady Constance, by then aware of the whole business, teased him mercilessly for his trouble. "You might simply admit you missed the woman, Julian," she said to him once within my hearing, for by then I had ceased entirely to be invisible to either of them, having earned, I suppose, a measure of trust through simple years of steady service. There is no shame in a man missing good company. There is considerably more shame in a man spending 4 years and a small fortune on inquiry agents rather than simply admitting it. "I do not know that I miss her company in particular, aunt," he said, with the particular stiffness of a man protesting too much. "I am concerned for her welfare, having treated her ill. That is a different matter entirely." "Is it?" said Lady Constance, in a tone that made it entirely clear she believed no such thing, and I confess I did not believe it either, having watched him these 4 years grow steadily quieter and more thoughtful on the subject of Miss Fairweather, than any mere guilty conscience required. It was, in the end, neither the agency nor the solicitor nor the newspaper advertisement that found her. It was I myself, and I confess I take a small and perhaps unbecoming pride in the fact, though it came about entirely by accident, as the best things in life so often do. In my 6th year at Ashwick Park, now serving as full butler, having risen through the household with what I hope was earned diligence, I was sent by the Duke on an errand to the market town of Fenbridge, some 32 miles distant, to settle an account with a saddler who had done fine work for the stables. My business concluded earlier than expected, and I found myself with an idle hour before my hired chaise was to return me home, and so I walked the high street of Fenbridge as any man might, looking into shop windows with nothing better to do. It was in the window of a modest establishment near the market cross, its sign painted in careful gold letters reading Miss Fairweather's Academy for Young Ladies, that I stopped so suddenly a woman behind me nearly walked into my back. I stood there like a fool for a full minute, staring at that sign, scarcely daring to credit it. Fairweather was not so uncommon a name that I could be entirely certain, and yet something in me knew, the way a man knows a voice before he has fully placed it, and I found my feet carrying me to the door before my head had properly decided the matter. The room beyond the window was a schoolroom, plainly but comfortably fitted, with perhaps a dozen desks and a large slate at the front covered in a neat, firm hand with sums half worked through. And there, at the front of that room, in a gown of good plain wool the color of autumn beech leaves, her hair dressed simply but becomingly, stood Miss Eleanor Fairweather, 6 years older than when I had last seen her, and looking, I want to say plainly, happier than I had ever once seen her look in 4 years at Ashwick Park. She was laughing at something a pupil had said, actually laughing, a full and easy sound I had never once heard from her in the Duke's house, where her manner, however kind, had always carried the particular careful restraint of a woman perpetually aware she occupied a precarious position in another family's home. Here, in this small rented room with its dozen desks, she stood as a woman entirely her own mistress, and it changed her bearing so completely that I understood, in that single glance through a shop window, everything the years at Ashwick Park had cost her without my ever having known it while she lived among us. I did not go in that day. I have thought since about why I hesitated, and I believe it was because I did not wish to intrude upon something that looked, from where I stood, entirely complete in itself. She did not appear to be a woman nursing a wound. She appeared to be a woman who had built, with her own hands and her own good sense, a life that suited her exactly, and I did not know whether the Duke's belated remorse had any right to walk into it. But I did make inquiry, discreetly, of the woman at the haberdasher's 2 doors down, as to how long Miss Fairweather's academy had been established in Fenbridge, and learned it had been some 3 years, that Miss Fairweather was well regarded in the town, kept a dozen pupils of good families at reasonable fees, employed 1 assistant teacher and a maid of all work, and was spoken of, in the haberdasher's carefully neutral phrase, as a most respectable and superior sort of woman, though she keeps her own counsel, and has never encouraged the attentions of the gentlemen hereabouts who have tried. I carried that intelligence home to Ashwick Park with a heart considerably more troubled than I had expected, and it was 3 full days before I found occasion, or courage, to bring the matter to the Duke. I found him on the 3rd evening, alone in his study, which was by then a familiar sight, for in the years since Miss Fairweather's departure he had grown into a quieter man than the arrogant young lord I had first served. Though never an unkind one, his had become, I think, the particular loneliness of a man who has learned better manners too late to enjoy the company they might have won him. "Your Grace," I said, "I wonder if I might speak on a private matter." He looked up from his ledgers with the faint surprise my request always seemed to occasion in him, for I was not, even after 6 years, a man given to seeking private audience. "Of course, Harding. What is it?" "I have found Miss Fairweather, your Grace," I said, "in Fenbridge. She keeps a school there, an academy for young ladies. She is well, and by every account I could gather, much respected in the town. I have seen a great many things in a long life of service, but I do not think I have ever seen a man go so entirely still, nor so entirely transparent, as the Duke of Ashwick did in that moment. His pen, which he had been holding, dropped from his fingers and left a small blot upon the ledger page, a blot I noticed him glance at only once, briefly, days later, and never troubled to correct, as though he wished to keep it as a kind of marker of the moment. "Fenbridge," he repeated, "you are certain you saw her yourself?" "I did, your Grace. Through the window of her own schoolroom. She did not see me. I did not think it my place to intrude." He sat back in his chair, and I watched a whole procession of things cross his face. Relief. First, plain and unguarded relief that she was alive and well, which told me a great deal about the private fears he had carried these 6 years and never once spoken aloud. Then something more complicated, a kind of dread mixed with hope that I recognized because I had felt something like it myself, waiting outside her schoolroom window. And then, last of all, a species of resolve that I had seen in him only rarely, and always in matters of real consequence. The estate's finances in a hard year, a tenant dispute he had insisted on settling personally and fairly though it cost him money to do so. "I must go to her," he said, and then, more quietly, as though the thought frightened him even as he spoke it, "though I do not know that she will wish to see me at all, and I could not blame her for it." "If I may say so, your Grace," I said, for 6 years of trusted service had won me leave to say a good deal more than I once could have, "I do not think Miss Fairweather is a woman who does anything without careful thought. If she did not wish to be found, I expect she would have taken greater pains to remain hidden than the placing of her own name in gold letters above a shop door in a market town 20 miles distant. I do not say she wishes to see you, your Grace. I say only that I do not think she has spent 6 years hiding from the world. I think she has spent 6 years living in it, rather better than she was permitted to live at Ashwick Park." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face, I want to call it humility, though it sits strangely to use so grand a word for so plain an expression, told me he had heard the whole of what I meant and had not flinched from it. "You have never spoken so plainly to me before, Harding," he said. "No, your Grace. I did not think you would have heard it 6 years ago. And you think I will hear it now. I think, your Grace, that a man who has spent 6 years and a small fortune searching for a woman he once said he scarcely noticed more than a chair has already answered that question for himself, whether he has said it aloud or not." He almost smiled at that, a rare thing in those later years, though not so rare as it had once been. "I shall go to Fenbridge on Thursday," he said. "Alone, I think. This is not an errand for a duke's carriage and a duke's retinue. I have made that mistake with her before, treating her as part of the furnishings of my consequence rather than as a person to be approached plainly, on her own ground, as an equal. I do not intend to make it again." He was as good as his word. On Thursday morning he took the gig himself, with no groom, no outrider, no liveried announcement of his rank, dressed as plainly as a duke can manage to dress, which is to say still very well, but without the ducal coronet stamped upon every visible surface of his conveyance, as I had gently suggested to him the evening before might be the wiser course, and which he had, somewhat to my surprise, accepted without argument. I was not present for what followed, for it was no part of my place to attend him on so private an errand, but he told me the whole of it himself, some days later. In the unguarded way a man will sometimes tell an old and trusted servant what he cannot bring himself to tell his own family, and I set it down here as faithfully as I can recall his account, because I believe it is the heart of this story, and because Miss Fairweather herself in later years confirmed to me that his account was true in every particular, save that she added a few details of her own that I shall include when I come to them. He arrived in Fenbridge a little before 4 in the afternoon, an hour he had chosen, he told me, because he judged the school day would be concluding, and Miss Fairweather would be free of her pupils but not yet so late in the evening as to seem an intrusion upon her private hours. He left the gig at the inn and walked the short distance to the schoolroom on foot, and stood, for some minutes, upon the opposite side of the street, gathering the courage that I understand from him did not come easily even to a man who had faced down hostile tenants and hard-dealing solicitors without a flicker of nerves. The schoolroom door stood at the side of a modest but well-kept building, its brass fittings polished, a small brass plate beside the door repeating the gold-lettered promise of the window sign. He crossed the street, removed his hat and knocked. It was Miss Fairweather herself who opened the door, an account book still in one hand, her spectacles pushed up into her hair where she had forgotten them, and the Duke told me that the sight of her standing there, entirely unguarded, entirely herself, struck him with such force that he very nearly lost the whole carefully composed speech he had practiced the length of the journey. She knew him at once, of course. 6 years had changed him. There was more gray at his temples than his 28 years, no, 34 years by then, quite warranted, and a certain weathering about the eyes that had not been there before, but she knew him at once, and the Duke told me, with a kind of wondering humility that I had never before heard in his voice, that she did not curtsy. She had curtsied to me 1,000 times in 4 years at Ashwick Park, Harding, he said to me. Every morning, every evening, whenever I passed her in a hall or a doorway, the same correct, perfect curtsy a companion owes a duke. I had never once in all that time thought to wonder what it cost her to make it. And there she stood in her own doorway in her own house, and she did not curtsy to me at all. She only looked at me very steadily and said, "Your Grace, I had not thought to see you in Fenbridge." He told her then, standing on her own doorstep with his hat in his hand like a tradesman soliciting custom, that he had come to say what he ought to have said 6 years before, and had been 6 years too proud and too blind to understand needed saying. He told her he had heard from his aunt what she had overheard that night, and that he did not ask her forgiveness for the words themselves, which he could not now unsay, but for the 6 years of blindness that had let him speak them at all, for a heart that had looked at a woman of grace and good sense every day for 4 years and seen nothing but a useful fixture of his house. "I did not come to ask you back to Ashwick Park, Miss Fairweather," he told her, and this detail he related to me with particular care, as though it mattered to him that I understood he had learned this much at least. I understood, standing there, that Ashwick Park was the very last place you would ever wish to return to, and I would not have insulted you by suggesting it. I came only to tell you that I am sorry, plainly and without excuse, and that I have thought of you, and of my own conduct toward you, very often in 6 years, and have tried, I hope with some success, to become a man less deserving of your contempt than I was when you knew me. Miss Fairweather herself told me, some years later, when she had come to trust me enough to speak freely of that day, that she had stood in her own doorway through this whole speech with her heart beating so hard she was certain he must hear it, and had said nothing for a long moment after he finished, not from unkindness, but because she did not trust her voice. I had built a whole life, Thomas, in which I never thought of him at all, or told myself I did not, she said to me. And there he stood, hat in hand, saying the very words I had given up hoping any man of his rank would ever trouble to say to a companion, and I did not know whether to be glad of it or angry that it had taken 6 years, and required me to build an entire independent life before he could see me as worth the trouble of an apology. What she said to him in that moment was considerably more measured than what she felt, for she was ever a woman of great composure, and she told me she had said only, "You have come a long way to say so, Your Grace. I thank you for it. It could not have been an easy thing for a proud man to say." It was not, he admitted, but it was considerably easier than living 6 more years without having said it. She did not invite him in that first day. The account book in her hand was evidence enough that she had pupils' fees to reckon and a school to run. And she was not, whatever her private feelings, a woman inclined to drop her whole day's business at the mere appearance of a repentant duke on her doorstep, however handsome his apology. But she did, before he took his leave, agree that he might call again the following week, if he happened to find himself again in Fenbridge, and he told me that this small permission, granted with such careful and dignified restraint, felt to him a greater victory than any he had won in 6 years of managing an estate. He did happen to find himself in Fenbridge the following week, and the week after that, and though I was not privileged to witness the whole slow architecture of what followed, I came to understand its shape from both of them, in fragments, over the better part of a year. He did not court her as a duke courts a woman he considers beneath him, with gifts too costly to refuse and attentions too public to escape. He courted her instead, as I believe she had always deserved to be courted, and never had been as an equal on her own ground in her own time. He came to Fenbridge as a private gentleman, not as the Duke of Ashwick, and he learned, over the course of that year, a great many things about her he had never troubled to learn in 4 years of living under the same roof. That she had taught herself Italian from a borrowed grammar book during her years as a companion, because Lady Constance had once expressed a wish to hear Dante read aloud, and no one else in the house could oblige her. That she kept bees now, in a small garden behind her school, and had a gift for it that surprised even her. That she had opened her academy on a loan from a widowed cousin she had never mentioned to the Ashwick household, and had paid back every shilling of it within 2 years through nothing but her own diligence and good management. A fact she told him with a quiet pride that he later confessed had humbled him more thoroughly than any sermon could have done. He learned, too, and this I believe cost him the most to learn, that she had been happy these 6 years, not merely resigned, not merely making the best of a hard situation, but genuinely, deeply happy in a life she had built entirely by her own hand, and that whatever he might come to mean to her, she had no need of him. She did not require rescuing. She required, if anything, to be asked, plainly and honestly, whether she wished to share a life with a man who had once failed to see her at all, and whether the man asking had become someone worth the risk. He asked her in the end, on a fine autumn afternoon nearly a year after his first visit to her doorstep, in the small garden behind her schoolroom where her bees hummed among the last of the season's asters. And I have this account, again, from both of them, for I had by then become so trusted a confidant to each that they seemed to find a peculiar comfort in telling me their halves of the same story. "I am not the man who once spoke of you as a chair," he told her, "though I will carry the memory of having been that man for the rest of my life, as a caution against ever becoming him again. I am asking you now, not as a duke offering a companion a position, but as a man asking a woman he has come to love, entirely on her own merits and by her own name, whether she would do him the very great honor of becoming his wife. I have no claim on you, Alina. You built a life that does not need me in it. I am only asking whether you might want me in it regardless." She told me she had wept then, for the first time in all the years since that night in the corridor at Ashwick Park, though she had wept alone in her room that night 6 years before and never let a soul see it until this later telling to me, and that the tears surprised her because they were not sorrowful at all, but the plain relief of a long-carried weight finally set down. "I did not leave Ashwick Park to punish you, Julian," she told him, and it was, he said, the very first time in all their acquaintance that she had called him by his given name, a small thing that he told me struck him harder than any grand declaration could have done. "I left because I could not stay and keep my own dignity both. I built this life because I found, once I was free of that house, that I rather liked the woman I became when no one required me to be invisible. If I marry you now, I do not do it to return to what I was. I do it because you have shown me, this past year, that you no longer require me to be invisible either, and that is the only man I would ever have said yes to. They were married the following spring, in the small parish church at Fenbridge rather than the grand chapel at Ashwick Park, at Miss Fairweather's particular wish, and I had the great honor of standing among the guests, no longer merely a butler in attendance but a friend invited in his own right, a fact that Lady Constance, radiant and much restored to health by the joy of the occasion, made certain everyone present understood, introducing me to the assembled company as the good man who found her, and who, I am persuaded, loved them both long before either had the sense to admit they loved each other. I will not pretend the years since have been without their small difficulties, for no marriage between two people of strong character is ever entirely without friction, and the Duke of Ashwick remains, even now, a man of considerable pride, though it is a pride tempered these days by a humility he earns fresh every day in small ways, in the way he asks his wife's counsel on the estate's affairs and takes it seriously, in the way he has never once, in all the years since, forgotten to thank a servant by name for a service rendered, in the particular gentleness with which he treats his aunt's memory. For Lady Constance lived to see her grandnephew's wedding, and 2 years of his happiness besides, before she passed peacefully in her sleep with Aliner's hand in hers. The Duchess of Ashwick, as she is now, kept her school at Fenbridge running for some years after her marriage, under the daily management of the assistant teacher she had trained up herself, visiting twice weekly to keep her own hand in its running, for she told her husband plainly, before ever she agreed to marry him, that she would not give up the work that had taught her who she was for any title in England, and he, to his very great credit, never once asked her to. I am an old man now. Writing this account in the quiet of a retirement, the Duke insisted upon settling on me with a generosity I never sought, though I have come to accept it as the plain gratitude of two people who never forgot that I stood witness to the whole of their story, from its cruelest beginning to its kindest end. I think often of that night in the pantry polishing silver, watching a good woman go still under the weight of careless words, and I think of the years that followed her building, quietly and without complaint, an entire life out of the wreckage of that one evening, and him learning, slowly and at real cost to his pride, to become a man capable of walking, hat in hand, up to her door and asking to be let in as an equal rather than commanding as a duke. She curtsied to him 1,000 times at Ashwick Park, and it cost her, I think, something of herself with every single one. She never curtsied to him again after the day she left, not once, not even at their own wedding, where by custom she might have been expected to make some small gesture of deference before the assembled company. She walked to meet him at the altar with her chin level and her eyes steady, exactly as she had walked away from him 6 years before, and I have always believed that was the truest measure of what he had won. Not a woman restored to her old place in his house, but a woman who had never needed restoring at all, and who chose him, in the end, entirely on her own 2 feet. That I have come to believe, watching the whole long arc of it from a footman's quiet corner to an old friend's honored chair, is the only kind of love worth the having between a proud man and a dignified woman, not one that lifts her up to meet him, for she required no lifting, having raised herself already by her own hand, but one that finally, humbly, climbs down to meet her exactly where she stands. And if there is a moral in it for anyone who cares to take one, I believe it is simply this, that the people we fail to notice are very often the ones whose absence teaches us, at whatever cost, precisely how much we ought to have seen.